Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I hope you are enjoying your RSA conference so far. My name is Lisa Ashjian, and I will be your moderator for today's panel discussion on building an extended detection and response, or XDR, architecture strategy, including why XDR is important, the considerations for your XDR strategy, and some best practices on how to get started. And joining me today are three subject matter experts, each bringing unique perspectives into the elements of XDR. And they have come together here to help you on your journey to building that XDR architecture strategy. We have Rakesh Shah, who is the Director of Architecture for AT&T Cybersecurity and is currently leading the development of AT&T's threat detection and response services. Next, we have Allison Clelan, who is the Director of Threat Operations for AT&T Cybersecurity and leads multiple security operations centers covering numerous security products. And finally, we have Jared Phipps, who is the Senior Vice President of Solutions Engineering for SentinelOne and a veteran of the United States Air Force, where he worked in cyber defense and offensive cyber operations. Welcome to each one of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to help educate our listeners on this important topic. All right, and as we jump into this discussion today, please feel free to ask your questions via chat, and we're here to help answer those for you. So with that, let's kick off right into our first topic of why XDR. We have all heard about extended detection and response, or XDR. But panelists, can you help us with what is included in XDR and what can this do to help a business's security ecosystem?
I'll take that one. XDR is a new hot term. It's very exciting in the industry. And really what it is it's addressing two major problems that have plagued the security industry for many years. Number one, alert fatigue. Just being overwhelmed with the alerts coming in, analysts not knowing how to manage those, and just, frankly, afraid that they're going to miss something. And then number two, tool overload, where, due to the kind of explosion in security tools and just the threat surface that's out there, there's just a lot more tools out there, and that's kind of overwhelming. And XDR is this really intended to try to fix those two problems with alert overload and tool overload.
Yeah, I'll tag in with Rakesh on that one. I mean, coming out of the Air Force, we had this methodology, defense in depth, and we kind of used to joke around, and really what it was expense in depth, right? If you look at cybersecurity today, what I would tell you is it's largely a data problem. There's an app for that, right? Like there's a vendor for that. There's a vendor for every little niche challenge you have in cybersecurity. They all want to generate alerts. Everybody wants to give you alerts. What we need to move towards, and kind of what we need to transform as an industry, is towards a data management. And how can we start to scale? How can we automate? XDR is the fundamental architecture that enables the way we're going to be able to do security operations in the future.
Awesome. Thank you both for that perspective. Alert fatigue, tool overload, and then the ability to scale all of these different point solutions. Absolutely, that's the power of XDR. But this concept isn't new, right? Why is this so important now, and how is this different than before?
Lisa, I'll try to answer that one. I really think the difference now is the focus on orchestrated response, and I think Rakesh and Jared both talked a little bit about the evolution over time, and we went from big data gathering and just try to get all the logs in, and then the focus was on making sense of all of this data and better visualization tools and using detections using correlations to help combat some of that analyst alert fatigue that Rakesh mentioned. The focus now is really shifting a little bit towards that orchestrated and automated response, and that helps us reduce the time to respond and minimize damage. We see that passing investigations between teams takes too long. We lose the context. The urgency is lost. we might accidentally or inadvertently reintroduce another vulnerabilities later. And I've just seen companies too many times have this be impacted by the same malicious activity repeatedly due to delayed or poor response action.
Yeah, and then kind of building on what Allison is describing, I think it's really interesting if you look at one change that's been very dramatic the last 10 years or so, and I think why XDR is more important than ever is, the explosion of cloud, right? Digital transformation, infrastructure as a service, software as a service. The threat landscape has expanded pretty significantly because of that. And so some of those operational challenges, as Allison mentioned, were there before, and now they're exacerbated because the threat can come from anywhere. And so it's even more important now to be able to have that visibility and to be able to do something about that, because that it's just exploding, and it makes sense given that cloud is kind of the new thing.
Yep, definitely. So, being able to have an orchestrated response and really reducing the time to respond in the more complicating way that we're transforming with cloud and other digital means. So absolutely agree with you there. But part of the promise from XDR is this automated response and machine learning capabilities. How could this machine learning help a business improve their security posture?
Well, I'd love to answer that. And I think there's a lot to that question to delve into. So I said earlier that I think cybersecurity is a data problem. And let me reiterate this, right? We talk about alert fatigue. But when we start to get into the EDR and the NDR and now extended data response, the XDR world, really what we're talking about, and a lot of people assume we're talking about, is data capture. So if I can capture events and capture data from all these different places, then I have an XDR solution. Capturing data does not mean you're understanding data. For example, I can tell you from the SentinelOne installations that we have globally, 73% of the time that we make a detection, there is no known record of that artifact in a reputation intelligence service. And if I drill into that a little bit and I go into like documents, PDFs, where we get into specific file types, 96% of the time that we make a detection, we say that those are malicious. There is no record whatsoever of those existing in a reputation intelligence service. So just collecting data and then being able to come back and query that data, that's not an intelligent way to do operations. That's actually a very legacy way. And then what we wind up with is trying to lean on threat intelligence to go hunt and understand what happened in the past. What XDR is going to give us is the option to understand data, use AI, use machine learning, because decisions need to be made in milliseconds. Now, that's the reality. The prevention decisions need to be made in milliseconds. They need to be made by machines that can then kick off automated and orchestrated responses. And that's what we've been pioneering here for the last several years. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about what we're doing, because I've lived in that cybersecurity world. Like, I've done that grind of alerts, and then I get my CERT notifications, I get my NSA notifications, I got to go run queries and come back. And it's just overwhelming. It's time-boggling. When you're coming up with a different solution that says, we're going to use AI, we're going to use machine learning, we're going to respond to these things in milliseconds, we're going to natively make everything intelligent, it's completely transformational. I literally think XDR will be an inflection point for the cybersecurity industry as a whole.
Absolutely, that's powerful. Anything else to add for the panelists?
Sure, I would just add, I would just put some of the things that Jared mentioned there. I do think that malicious activity is less and less about IOCs. It's less signaturable. It can be combinations of seemingly benign activities. I think the advancement of user behavioral analytics and machine learning really assists analysts in pivoting through data sources based on techniques or TTPs and the adversary attack lifecycle. It really helps the analyst better discern between what I would consider what I would call, I guess, an explained anomaly and actually and higher confidence malicious activity. So I do think that those are going to be really valuable in Jared's point, getting time to respond.
Yep, yeah, definitely helping. Wow, that's some very powerful points. The going beyond the data capture, being able to respond quickly, Wow, 73% of threats were unknown, and 96 were malicious of those. Wow, that's pretty powerful, and certainly see the need for that automated response and machine learning capabilities. So really appreciate everybody's feedback there. Let's go ahead and switch gears into the considerations needed for building an XDR strategy. So let's talk about that in a little more depth. So my first question is, can you guys help describe what I hear called the ground up or versus a top-down approach to addressing XDR? And how are they different, and how will that play a role in a business's approach to their XDR architecture strategy?
Yeah, I really love hearing that approach. And I think as you're considering building out your XDR architecture, the first thing to look at is, the SIEM has been the de facto pane of glass for security operations for 20 plus years, right? And start with the assets that you have, right? And most enterprises have a SIEM or some capability to do that level of monitoring. And I think that's kind of the top down. As you start there and you go, what data am I collecting? I think, kind of building, as Jared said, understanding the data first and kind of getting that visibility. And then in parallel, what we've seen in the last, 5-10 years is that EDR has kind of emerged as that second pane of glass, if you will, where folks are looking for that to go, well, hey, I'm detecting threats here for a lot of my hunting or investigations. I'm leveraging the forensics in my EDR solution. So they're kind of peanut butter and jelly, right? One's coming from the top down, the other one's kind of coming from the bottom up. And I think that as you look at your architecture, start thinking about how those pieces are coming together. And I give an example. I talked to a Fortune 500 CISO a couple of, maybe a year or two ago, and they were going through a spreadsheet with all their different solutions. It was like 70 or 80 different vendors that they have deployed. And they're like, I just can't figure this out. I don't know where to go. And so I think as you're thinking about XDR, you've got your spreadsheet in front of you with all your different solutions. Maybe start with the SIEM, look at the EDRs that you have, and kind of make that your foundation and think about how those can come together.
Yeah, to tag on what Rakesh is saying, like, if I was looking at architecting out, like, let's say I'm back in my former role in the Air Force and I'm looking at architecting out a solution, I'm going to start with complexity being a number one issue that I want to resolve and get out of the way. And number two is I'm looking for context because I already know that I'm going to have data. Data is going to be everywhere. Why? And I see a lot of organizations starting their XDR strategy now by focusing on the endpoint. And that's because that's the last line. Like that's where everything happens. That's what gets attacked. That's where the data gets taken from. Endpoints, servers, everything of this nature is where compute happens. If you think about it in terms of context, I had, when I was in the Air Force in the SOC, we had 32 analysts on shift 24/7. And this is 10 plus years ago, so it's not this way anymore. But I still see this type of a mentality as I go through corporate America, where if an analyst is going to look at an alert, they're going to pull it out of the SIEM. There might be one or two recommendations by the SIEM from another product, but they check out that alert and they start to investigate that alert. 3 rows down, someone else is checking out a different alert, investigating that alert. There's no context of whether it's not the same event. Now let's do an analogy to a crime scene, right? If you have a crime scene, does an investigator walk in and say, I'm with FBI, and then they do their investigation in a silo, and then somebody else walks in from the sheriff's office and they do their investigation? Like, no, investigations get shared, right? And information gets shared. The crime scene has orders and processes to go with it. So the value of what I want to architect and build from is, how do I get context around the data, and then how do I simplify the approach for the investigators that have to use that data?
Awesome. Yeah, that's, wow, both good responses there. So just bringing this technology together, coming together, being able to make it simple. And I love the crime scene analogy. That's too true with the situations that our SOC teams face when they're analyzing those threats. So appreciate everybody's feedback there. So now let's jump to the next question here when it comes to considerations for that architecture strategy. And that is that what are the challenges business face with threat detection and response, and how does a business determine the gaps they have with their current threat detection and response architectures?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big one, right? There's like so many dimensions you can approach it from, right? There's the technology perspective, which we've talked, a bit about. There's looking at your people and, what resources you have. There's also looking at your processes, right? The kind of triad of people, process, and technology. And you can start there. I mean, I take a simpler approach, and maybe I'm too simple, is like look at where the threat actor is coming from. If you've done red team exercises, if you have an understanding of, where they're taking advantage of kind of the threat surface area, which, as we've talked about, is expanding, that's where you can look for those gaps. And so I think, using the prism of people, process, technology, I think you have to start there because the gaps can be addressed in all three dimensions. But then, do some real, red team exercises, figure out, what the threat actor might do or is doing, and use that to kind of determine your prioritization, because it's a lot to take on all at once.
And I would say, in combination with understanding the threat and the attackers, TTPs and frame of mind, you really have to have a good knowledge of your network. What's your key terrain? What are you trying to protect, and how? And the attack surface, as Rakesh mentioned, is ever changing. So you can't just do this once and forget about it. There are going to be vulnerabilities that exist over time that weren't accounted for. And I think coupling this with your business objectives and then any compliance requirements, those three components will yield a fairly extensive and complete gap analysis.
Awesome, great points. Aligning with those business objectives, that's extremely important. And those red team exercises to help identify the gaps, great suggestion, Rakesh. And then not forgetting about the network elements and that digital transformation that our businesses are undergoing, and taking that into consideration. So really appreciate that insight. So the next question is, what are some of the pitfalls and challenges as a business works to pursue an XDR strategy?
I'll start with that one, because I do help companies all the time as they start to develop out their XDR strategy and the thought process. I think one of the things to consider is you need to start with the end in mind. When you're thinking of your strategy, do you want to have technology that empowers people, or do you want to build a program that's people using tech to get results? And figure which one of those two scales, right? So if you want a scalable solution, then you're looking for solutions where technology empowers people. Automation, AI, machine learning, pull in vendors that have that class of capability. From there, then, there's other two things that I would say that is a concern. Number one is just vendor fatigue, tool set fatigue. It's not just the expense of buying them. You've got to train on them. You have to sustain them, even if they're in the cloud. Right? That just gets to be a fatigue over time, especially when you're dealing with 70 plus solutions. It gets exhausting, frankly, having run that world. The other caution I would give about is a vendor lock-in, right? So to get away from that fatigue of too many solutions, the opposite swing of that pendulum is, I'm going to pick vendor A and I'm just going to buy everything that vendor ecosystem has. Like, that's the easy button, right? Because it checks all the boxes. The problem with that is that you are now limited by that vendor ecosystem. Is the entire ecosystem tech powering people? Probably not. It's probably tech, and they're expecting you to instrument it and implement it. Furthermore, if you're going to have a bypass, or someone figures out a way to bypass product A, it's probably going to bypass pretty much the entire ecosystem. So you've put all your eggs in one basket. I think the promise of XDR is actually simplifying and making a much easier way to use multiple vendors in your ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jared. And I think that it gets back to being, look, a lot of us are technologists. We geek out on what vendors are doing and what the next new hot thing is, and talk AI and ML. But, you do have to be business smart, right? I think, as Jared said, wearing that other hat and just thinking that through. And look, security has a pendulum. It's going to go back and forth, right? There'll be best in breed is the new thing. Then it's going to be, consolidated security stack. That's the easy button. And, that's going to change over time. And so I think, be business smart, and then, make sure you've got that hat on so that when you're talking to your colleagues who don't understand the technology and don't geek out on that, you really have that nailed, and make sure you're not falling into traps like vendor lock-in.
Yeah, great points, both of you. And I think, Rakesh, being business smart goes back to what Allison mentioned earlier about aligning your XDR strategy to your business objectives. So spot on there. And then, Jared, the diversify yet simplify kind of message is very important when it comes to building that XDR strategy. So let's jump into the next question here. What elements should go into developing the internal architecture and purchasing policies for the business's XDR strategy?
Yeah, and I think this, I'll say it again, be business smart again, because you really want to understand, what are the business drivers, and, and then drive that to outcomes, right? Looking at threats, looking at the network, looking at the environment, and then figuring out how that impacts not only your internal architecture, but how that impacts the business. And so it's almost like the easier way to look at it, and it's not the easy button, is go, what are my security and business outcomes, right? What am I trying to drive? And then work back from there to look at the threat actors and the TTPs and your network, as we've talked about, and kind of go in that dimension. Because I think if you start with technology, if you start with like this, it's going to lead you to a lot of different paths, and you may just get lost in the alphabet soup. But if you start with what are you trying to solve from a security and business outcomes perspective, and then flow it from there, it'll make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, the one recommendation I would add to that is on the business outcomes, for whatever reason, and I get into cybersecurity, this is probably where we start here, but for whatever reason, the emphasis when people are architecting and designing this up front is always around the investigation and the detection capabilities. There's two elements that I think often get overlooked. Number one is prevention. It's, I think we've had this mentality of assume compromised, and that's great to have that paranoia mindset. But there's nowhere in assume compromise that means you have to assume a defeatist posture. Go after technologies that are going to prevent and block as much as possible, because you want to investigate as little as possible. And that final step is really focused on a business outcome, which is business resilience and business continuity. You want to be online, right? You do not want your business taken offline. So how do you recover from attacks? If you're in the XDR world and you can orchestrate the detections, or you can orchestrate the investigations, can you orchestrate the recovery? What does that look like? How long does that take? If you can't go from detection to recovery in under 10 minutes, keep looking, because there's people that can get you there.
Great. Yeah, that's very good insight. Thank you to Rakesh and Jared both. Driving business outcomes, absolutely imperative, and aligning to those business outcomes. The being proactive, Jared, the way you're describing it with prevention, and then definitely the focus of being resilient and business continuity, so important in today's environment. Okay, so let's move along to our next question here as we continue to consider the elements of building our XDR strategy. And that is, how would a business go about analyzing their internal staff skill sets, determine what additional skill sets are needed to manage in-house, versus when a business should consider an MSSP to manage an XDR solution?
Lisa, I love that you asked this question. We've been talking for the past 30 minutes or so about automating and orchestration, and ultimately you just can't completely remove the humans from this equation. You're always going to need a staff, and the talent shortage in this space is real. So it's going to come down to an organization's cost and risk appetite, but there are several I guess phases that you could go through to help you make that determination. I know for us internally, we started with a talent assessment, and we took a skills inventory of all of the folks in our organization. We created what almost looks like baseball cards that include any skills they currently have, any of their interests and hobbies. We did this in order to try to find pipeline and development paths for some of these folks, but also to find these hidden skills. Were there some skills that we had on the team that we weren't taking full advantage of? Were we optimizing the use of the talent that we already had? Did we have some folks that were scripting on the side that could have helped us with some of our DevOps and automation? Did we have folks that were prior auditors or really understood the compliance requirements that could help some of our customers in places that we hadn't thought about applying them to? So that really helped us with determining if we had any extra bandwidth on the team and if we were appropriately optimized. And I think to some of the points we talked about earlier, it helps us also with the burnout factor. I mean, we can't expect a lot of our teams to stay in these SOC analysts or tier 1 queues year after year. It's just not likely that we're going to be in a constant state of retraining and retaining talent if we don't have a great development pipeline for these folks. So ultimately, it's a challenge for a lot of our customers, including us, making these decisions about when to insource and outsource some of this work.
Yeah, I think I mentioned something earlier where you have to have technology that scales people, technology that empowers people, right? And I think that what I've seen is a major trend over the last several years is organizations of all sizes, the biggest in the world down to the smallest. Everybody now is leaning into MSSPs with different strategies. Some of the larger organizations, they want to be able to offload tier 1 responsibilities, which helps them retain the highly talented security staff and manage the complex architecture and investigations that those individuals are hired to do. In other cases, they want to be able to flex and have, I would say, overflow into MSSP teams, assistance on expert investigations and things of that nature. So those skill sets are very complementary. And I think that if you're looking in this world, like you'll see a lot of product vendors are adding in those types of services as well. So the notion today that you buy a product and you drop it in front of your team and you're good, I think you're starting to see that partnerships go everywhere, right? And so, I mean, if you look at the really good MSSPs in the world, like we're talking to now, they have figured out how to use technology to scale people, how to attract and train the right talent to retain that talent. And that lets them do things like sign SLAs and commit to things that larger, complex organizations simply need to have. So that's really the benefit I see. And I do have a lot of conversations with a lot of CISOs globally right now. Everybody's talking about this. Everybody's figuring out what their strategy here is.
Mm-hmm. Lots of things to consider. I really appreciate both tech to empower people, Jared, absolutely necessary, and considering those SLAs, very important. And then Allison, I love your baseball card analogy. That's very smart to go and look for those hidden skill sets amongst your team. And then an important consideration with the human factor is that cost and risk appetite and then the burnout factor for those security analysts. So appreciate everybody's perspective there. Thank you. So let's switch gears to our final topic, which is helping our listeners here with how to get started. So how would someone get started, especially if XDR is new to our listeners here? What type of evaluation and testing would be needed to be able to implement a strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, as you know, we've been all saying really, it's don't jump into the technology deep end. It's really easy and tempting to do that. And, I personally have worked for multiple security companies for many years. I love talking to security practitioners about technology, and you usually are talking about products, right? And it's just tempting to go down that path. Take a step back and look at security outcomes, right? If you're implementing GDPR or the California Protection Data Act, if you're going down those and you're saying that's something I have to implement in 2021, and that's a security outcome that you're driving to, then what are the people, the process, and the technology to get you there? And your KPIs will hopefully be driven by what your security outcomes are. And then I think XDR, you'll find the technology will fit into that, right? For all the reasons we've talked about, you need to have your team ready to, address those threats and not be overloaded. You need to not have, too many tools out there and too much overwhelming data. So I think that, you start with the security outcomes. What are you trying to drive? And then from there, technology will follow.
Yeah, and I think, if I could jump into that, I think something Rakesh said I think is really important is he said the word outcomes. Start with the outcomes in mind. There's no one size fits all. There's, you understand what's your company's risk profile? What is your company's desire for business continuity, business operations? If you start with the outcome in mind, then you can start picking the right partners. When it comes to the vendor side, everybody sounds very, very similar these days. And they always have in the space. I've sat 10 years on the buying side. I've sat 10 years on the vendor side. When it's successful, both parties, the buyer, the seller, both parties are really working together. So is there a culture fit between you and the vendor? Something a lot of people don't really think about and look about. They get into tech and price, but if it's the middle of the night and you wake someone up, is that person going to wake up? Are they going to be there for you? That those little things do matter a lot. And extend out your ecosystem into trusted partners and advisors. One of the great things about MSSPs, for example, is they don't just touch a lot of different technologies, they've used them firsthand at scale. And you can reach out to them for advice. Where should I look at for this technology? Tell me 2 or 3 that you'd recommend. What pitfalls did you run into when you were implementing this project in your organization? They can provide those insights, they can provide those lessons learned, and it is absolutely invaluable.
Awesome. Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody's input here. So I just want to see if there's any final thoughts from the group before we close out. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention today. And we are here to continue to answer your questions via chat. And we all hope that you continue to enjoy your RSA conference experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.